Let's begin with the most essential question before we talk about what bystanders can do, which is to say, all this while we've been talking about how domestic violence is often something that happens within the home. Who then is a bystander in the context of domestic violence? Anika, would you like to take this?
Especially in the case of domestic violence happening in the homes, the first person or people who are actually the part of a family are the first bystanders. They could be children, they could be elderly people in your family, anybody you live with. So those are your first immediate people, immediate witnesses, and many times pets also. I'm going to, of course, talk about that as well. So the people who are living with you, and then there are people who live around your house. Now here, something which was very important that Anuradha earlier broke down was that we need to look at domestic violence from outside of the marital home space, where it's not just about a couple or a couple living with a joint family, but also some girl, young women living with their parents and being in those domestic spaces, irrespective of what your relationship with the family or the people you live with, you cohabit with are. So again, we need to sort of broaden the understanding of what domestic spaces are and what family spaces look like, and they go beyond the marriage space. So the of course, when you have people either living with you or living next to you, they become your first bystander, like physical bystanders in that case, who get to witness if there are forms of abuse that are happening to a woman. Then we've also seen so we sort of take it a little ahead, and when we look at who the next bystander could be, that could be a person who's a relative, a friend, somebody who could be a neighbor, somebody, even your colleagues, your co-workers. If you go to your workplace, they become those bystanders who know what is either happening to you, uh, uh, or they may or may not say anything. I mean, that's the next step, but they become like your support sort of group and witness of what is happening to you in your life. Like I said, in many cases, there are a lot of, when it happens in spaces where there are pets in the house, that also that also actually adds to the dynamic. So, and also we need to make a distinction between what like an active bystander is and a passive bystander is. A passive bystander is just a spectator who's just looking at what is happening and may or may not intervene. But an active bystander is somebody who intervenes, who tries to reason with the perpetrator or just tries to diffuse that situation wherever that could be. But all of these situations sort of exist. Everybody's case is different. Everybody's life is different. Even in a public space, you have people who are strangers. Even in the online space, if you share something, you have people still talking to you. So they become the bystanders in that particular space. So basically, bystander is anybody who's living around you or has access to you, virtually or physically. So just to make, sort of make that distinction about a bystander.
And also, I think let's talk a little bit about the Bell Bajao campaign. I think as far as I remember, it was one of the first campaigns, in public to really talk about the role of the bystander and to actually say, hey, there's something concrete that you can do to diffuse a situation. Can you tell us a little more about the campaign itself and why you thought that there was a need to actually bring the bystander into this conversation, which often focuses around perhaps the survivor alone?
The journey actually started with the song Man Ke Manjeere, which sort of was the starting point for Breakthrough, when there were just a few, like a small group of people who worked on it, because there was a woman who had faced domestic violence. Shamim Patan, who's now who became pretty famous after a very famous case that she actually sort of fought during that time, and that sort of inspired an idea that we're still looking at domestic violence as somebody's personal matter, while it's a public matter, while it's a crime. That all of that understanding was still kind of being slowly built, but there was not really any conversation. So coming from that space, creating a media movement which challenges the culture of violence, which looks at domestic violence from the lens of like from a crime perspective, and not just as a domestic issue, is where the whole journey started. So from 99 to 2000 and so on, the people, the Malika Dutt, who's just started the movement, the album, they started going and doing all of these road shows. They met a lot of different women. They did a lot of media conferences also. And then they realized how common domestic violence was, but it was mostly talked from the lens of dowry harassment. Which is why even the law actually came into existence. But then, how do we challenge the culture itself? Of course, law legalities are at a stage when somebody actually wants to file a case, or somebody wants to fight that battle legally. But it's so hard for, and that's what we sort of saw, that it actually is super hard for women to actually firstly admit it, that they are being abused, and then actually say something to somebody, because that's also embarrassment and brings dishonor to family. And then third, go through that whole rigor of the process. That is like a journey in itself. And the fourth is like, what is the alternative? Where do you go after that? So because of all of this lack of understanding in the mainstream, um, we realized that we need to make it a cultural problem. Like, we need to understand where the culture of violence is actually coming from, and why. Firstly, we could not talk to the perpetrator, because that became like the hardest thing for us to sort of enter. Then we realized that who do we talk to? We talk to the victim, or survivor, who wants to actually come out, or may not want to come out, because that also adds to, of course, when we've talked about it, how that is in itself is um, like a challenge for the victim. So because of the lack of support, lack of resources and understanding, all of these things actually emerged during our research, during our work in the communities, and we realized that the bystander is whom we will be addressing this particular campaign to. While a lot of work happens within the communities, the families, this is the main one simple action that somebody can go and interrupt an act of violence if they hear something, they see something, is where the whole idea actually started. Bell bajao, the whole concept is ring the bell when you hear domestic violence. It may see, and that's the whole point, that how do you make it so simple for a bystander to intervene, because that is another daunting task for bystanders. Even in the current, I'm sure like Madhumitha can add more to why people do not intervene and how that becomes a challenge. But culturally, we only speak out when there are certain other, I'd say, moral deviances when we see it. But this is not a problem that we see from a moralistic lens. Domestic violence is normal. It's okay. It's between them. Because of that kind of mindset, we realize that we have to work with that, or flip that culture, which actually enables that. And hence, Bell Bajao became Bell Bajao, and then we did all of these TVCs and ads and the whole campaign. And it took us a lot of like time, many years to kind of bring it into the public consciousness, to sort of make domestic violence, or understand domestic violence from the crime lens. So yeah, that's where it kind of started. And coming from a communication understanding, you always go with one single big message and then you break it down. but the single message was the most important, and hence we feel that was effective as well.
Thank you, Anika. What I'm getting is also that it's not only the large actions that make a difference, but even perhaps a small, simple action can make a difference to diffusing a situation that's happening in the moment. Before I go into my next question, I'd just like to remind those of you who are watching this on Facebook that you can send in your questions either by typing them in the comments section. We also have a Google Doc if you wish to send in your questions to us anonymously. Please send in your questions and we'll share them with our panelists and have them answered during the course of the next 20 minutes or so. Madhumitha, let's talk about, the workplace. Why is, Diversity Dialogues has just released a booklet on domestic violence and the Indian workplace. And we've been talking about how it's seen culturally as a matter that's as an intimate matter or something within the family. Why then is, why did you choose to work on this topic specifically? And does the timing of this ebook hold some sort of significance?
Right. Ranjitha, I'm going to go back a little bit and sort of also say that as I'm hearing this conversation today, the thing that comes to my mind is I think each one of us are bystanders. Because if 1 in 3 women are going through this, and that's what the statistics say, and we've not even explored what's happening with the LGBT community, what's happening with men, what's happening with people with disability, many of the other sections in the society, there is definitely a lot more. That's happening. So each of us, whether we know it or not, are bystanders, right? And I do want to narrate an experience around this, that when I started my career, and this is more than a decade back. I was this HR professional and working with a company. I had somebody sitting next to me, this person who was working quite well and all of that. And suddenly she decided to get married, went on marital leave, and then came back. And every day for the next about 9 months, she had scars in her hand. Okay. And she lost enormous amount of weight. She was always confused. There was a certain fear, there was a certain anxiety that she was holding, right? And I have to tell you, I was sitting next to her. We were colleagues working together, and I never realized there was anything wrong. you know that I consider myself as a person with a fair degree of empathy, but I somehow did not. I asked her what the bruises are about. She told me, oh, I was cutting something and all that, and I was like, oh, you're negligent at work, you're also negligent. I didn't tell her that, but in my mind I was thinking, okay, she's not performing at work, maybe she's also negligent at home. And that's what happens. So I was a bystander. Whether I chose to do something or not about it, I was still a bystander, right? And then, of course, it came to me. She never opened up. She decided to leave the organization. At that point, it came to me from another colleague, and this was the HR leader of the organization, who said, by the way, this person's leaving and this is the reason, and the person's also going through a divorce and all of that. So this is how it plays out. So for us to say that this is a private matter is something that we need to question, because the person sitting next to us is possibly going through something we don't know. Secondly, I think it's been spoken about multiple times in today's conversation that the person goes through fear. There is anxiety, there is a drop in performance, there is absenteeism, there is a lot of all that plays out, which directly, in many ways, even if I don't want to look at it from a consideration of being a good person or wanting to do the right thing for the society, it's also impacting workplace productivity, right? So there is a direct correlation between workplace productivity and this. And there is a lot of studies which say that. I mean, there is a study which is done by KPMG for Vodafone across their markets, and what it actually indicates is that the workplace impact is literally about 2.2 to about 9.7. That's the range, $1 billion for workplaces per annum, as a result of the domestic violence and that what is experienced, right? So there have been many instances like this in my work over a period of time. I've seen it with the LGBT space, I've seen it with persons with disability, and the common thread that I saw was that none of them would actually tell their workplace about it, because they always thought that they would never get an answer there, that there is a stigma associated, that we probably will end up losing our job there as well, right? And which is one of the reasons, I mean, this has been staying with me for many, many years, and which is one of the reasons we decided that we need to talk about this. Because if diversity and inclusion is about working with the LGBT community, is about working with persons with disability, is about working with women, and you're looking at increasing your representation and providing an inclusive workplace to all of these communities, all of them are also vulnerable to domestic violence, and you can't completely sort of exclude that. Right, and that was the reason the guide came into existence, to say that can workplaces do something about it, should workplaces play a role. And coming back, I think when you talk about financial empowerment, one of the reasons also is that a lot of these vulnerable groups often don't have that, right? So how do you enable that? And that can be enabled by workplaces, that can be enabled by that ecosystem as well. So how do they play a role? And that's why it became important for us to put out a guide. And I do want to say that, you know, there are studies which say that, like, there is a study by SHRM which says that about 60% of organizations don't have any policy around domestic violence, but 19% of them have had instances where there have been people who have come and said, who have reported. Also, what if the domestic violence walks into office? You know, you have somebody stalking in the at the workplace, you have somebody on official emails constantly sort of stalking a person constantly. Then what do? Then there is workplace safety at risk as well. So that's why the reason, workplaces need to be able to look at it, and that's why the guide, so that, we put that out there and more workplaces can take to it.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. What is really the role of a bystander? And we talked about active bystanders and passive bystanders. For both of these, what is the role that they can play? Madhumitha?
Right. So I am going to again come to it from a workplace standpoint. And the reason I'm choosing to do that is because, that's the area that I'm most comfortable and will talk basis my experience. If you're a manager or a team member, what can you really do when somebody approaches you, talks about it, etc.? Now, at one level, the bystander role in my mind is also to sort of make your own workplace safe, first of all, because if you're not doing that and you're being abusive at some level, then that's not going to work. So how are you bringing in a culture of respect? How are you making it a safe space for people to be able to speak about? Because otherwise, people will not open up, not only on this, on many other things. So that becomes sort of the first rule. And the second rule tied into that is zero tolerance for any kind of abuse or abusive behavior at the workplace, because that's how you start and you provide a safe space for people to be able to do it, right? Moving on further, what can you do? One is definitely have an access to resources, which is, for example, during especially the COVID times, given there has been the blur between, the workplace and the home. I mean, both have at some level gotten integrated. There are companies which put up a simple slide saying these are the resources which are available, which managers use in meetings and all of that. So to be able to talk about that, call out resources, is the first thing. The second thing is, at many levels, to ensure confidentiality, specifically if somebody is opening up to you, coming out to you and all of that, to ensure that this is not information, and really practice that in essence as well. Saying where will it go? If it will go to an HR person, then who is that person to whom it will go, right? The third and the most important thing I feel is having empathy. So to ask the person, how can I help you? How can I be there for you? Believing that that person has the autonomy to sort of decide, right? And not making yourself as the figure who will decide for the person, but to ask with that certain level of empathy, without any kind of statements around, it's your fault and you can work on this relationship and, you can do this and you can do that, or saying that these things happen and it doesn't matter. So to be able to provide that space of empathy and acknowledgement, because you possibly in this cycle will be one of the few players who will also give that to the person, that reassurance that what you're saying, I believe you, I hear you, and all of that, right? And then to spend time saying future, around future safety planning. That's something as an individual team member, as a manager, you can do, which is to ask questions around saying, oh, if you're going through this, then who will you call? Who will be your first point of contact? How are you maintaining your documents? How are you maintaining your electronic safety? So helping the person doing some level of safety planning. And I'm talking about just managers and the manager population at this point in time. What can the larger organization do? I think I will come to. But as an individual bystander, as a manager, as a team member, these are some of the things that you can do.
Anika, if we were to look at the role of a bystander beyond the workplace, what are some of the things that we could do?
As an individual who's not connected to NGOs, or who doesn't um, know about who doesn't know a lot about the services, or how the whole thing works, the first thing for any individual is that firstly you need to listen and not assume. So there are these very little tips, but they're very important, because what will happen is once you start assuming for the person. So here I'll give an example saying, yes, the world outside may be unsafe, but your homes are safe. So you need to go home. And it could be that could be a relative, that could be a friend, that could be a co-worker, that could be your student as well. So this assumption that the home is safe, this is an example, but all of these assumptions without actually understanding somebody's reality is a no-go. So you have to firstly not assume and listen, and actually listen. So, and you don't have to immediately start dispensing advice. Ye kar lo, ye kar lo, ye kar lo. Basis what? Because even to give that advice, you firstly you yourself need to be sensitized enough. You need to know what exactly is the process. And honestly, no two cases are the same. So hence you cannot say that, oh, I have this training, so I know what to do. That's just absolutely something that we would discourage. Listen to people. What Madhumitha said, that just having that empathy is important. The other thing where during the lockdown is something that we saw, and we all know how the cases really sort of shot up during the lockdown. Everybody's in the family spaces, which were supposed to be safe, but clearly not. Uh, how do you sort of create that communication bridge between somebody who's facing it and somebody who can just listen to them? So we realized that texting, people who had access to mobile phones, there were very young women who are like in college school, high school. They used to text each other, or they used to sometimes text even an organization like Breakthrough, because they had access to the internet space. So we realized that phone calls were dangerous. So text became easier, and also because they could be documented. So that is something that we need to sort of keep in mind. I'm talking specifically during the lockdown, but even during this pandemic, there is social distancing which is required. So ensure that we use text wisely. Ensure we are not giving too much advice. And then resources, again, same thing. If you do not have access to resources, look for them. Look for people who can help you. Look for all of this information. Sometimes a simple Google search could help, and that could give you a list of things, list of helpline numbers, list of resources which are maybe hyper local. And the other thing is, all of this is when you hear it like second hand. But what if you witness something? And the thing is, like I said, you may witness something which is physical in nature. Sometimes it could be somebody yelling. You could also witness somebody trying to insult or berate a woman in front of you, and you feel, this is normal. But you don't know the kind of impact it has on somebody. So even understanding those little cues is important, that domestic violence needn't just be physical, and we need to constantly talk about different forms of control and abuse, where that we need to start picking on, not just as individuals, even collectively as a society. That's something that is something we would definitely push for. And having the culture of empathy and of understanding, and I mean, or are we only going to understand somebody who's just because she's my friend, I'm going to listen to her, but that's a stranger, I'm not going to care about? No, you need to have empathy for the two of them equally. And of course, you can't spoon feed empathy, but that's something that we need to build on. And the last bit that we also realize that if you have to, if it's that bad, you have to intervene. Many times, what stops a bystander from intervention? Um, there are lots of reasons. One is indifference, something very, very common. Apathy, doesn't matter to me. Um, fear, fear of getting involved or injured, or getting harmed, basically, or insulted by the person who is uh, perpetuating the violence, and also somebody who's not ready to actually step out. So all of these things actually add up to a person who has to single-handedly do it. So what we're also pushing for is you collectivize, you talk to other friends, you talk to other family members who you feel would be with you, and intervene in numbers, because there's strength in numbers. That's something we've seen a lot of young people in our work areas doing that, because the adults were not listening to them. So then they got together, like 6, 7 young people got together. They went to the person's house who was getting abused by her father. And they just wanted to sort of give them this idea that, yeah, we know what you're doing. So that also made it a little better. So all of these are little things people could, they may sound little, but they have larger impact. But these are some things we've seen that have worked. And yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more that has to be done.
Yeah. I do want to add, 2 points here, which is one is around self-care for the bystander as well. So if you're somebody who's doing this, and you're being approached and it's the first time, it can be a very overwhelming experience for you also. So how do you take care of yourself? I think that is one. The second is sometimes, at least in my experience, there is a feeling that people hold that if they were to intervene, they would actually make the situation worse. Right. So I hold myself to some of the points I think Anika so rightly made. There is also that. And I feel that not speaking up and just being silent and just watching it will always sort of, speaking up is important. So give yourself that permission in different ways to bring that. If not anything else, to diffuse the situation, to distract. So figure out different ways of intervening, but intervening is important. Intervening is essential. That feeling that I will worsen the situation is the second one. The third is sometimes we believe we can be everything. So believing where your boundaries can be drawn. If you're a manager, for example, or a person who does not have experience in counseling, not to take on that role of giving advice and then counseling and listening for 2 hours and all of that, because it's going to also not work for you very well. But to know where do you want to stop, where will you, what is the role you will play? It could be just simply, I will access you to the right resources, and that could be great enough, right? But to just figure out what is the role you would play. So I just thought I'd add that.
Thank you. And Anika spoke of collective action. Madhumitha, if we were to talk about systems that are actually set up to be supportive, what can organizations do to support anybody in the workplace who may be experiencing domestic abuse?
Right. So I think there are a few things that an organization can definitely do. The first one is to break the taboo. And how do you break the taboo? You break the taboo by talking about it. So having sessions around it, not only for women at the workplace, for the men as well, for others, for people identifying from any gender, any sexuality, any background, to do it at a holistic scale. And to talk about it means that this is something that the organization recognizes happens, and we're giving voice to it, right? So it begins there. And I think it's important to do that. The second, like I said, is information and helplines, and having that very handy and available to everybody. So that, and I don't mean a workplace as in this, this whole big ecosystem with 10,000 employees. Even 5 employees is a workplace because it's a place where one goes to work, right? So do you have information? Do you have helplines? Do you have, these organization lists that somebody can then refer to? Because again, that's giving voice to the entire thing. The third is in terms of, is your existing mental health support in the organization, your existing employee assistance program, if you have one, or a counselor, are they sort of aware of this, trained, equipped to manage this, equipped to handle this? That's something to also check for. Then there is the whole angle of reasonable accommodation that I would bring in, which is to say that, can you offer safety leave? For example, if somebody is wanting to get out of that situation and needs some time off to be able to plan their life and so on, so are you giving them that kind of time that's there? Can you offer them support systems? And this could be in terms of legal support, for example. If an employee complains to you and says that, listen, I want to get out of this situation, can you transfer me to a different place? Can you look at ways and means of making that happen for employees, right? And also to consider then, if there is temporary accommodation available. A lot of organizations have guest houses, have spaces of themselves. If you can provide that and access to that, that's something to look at. The last bit of it, and which I think is very important, and all these things are basis what resources the organization has, but this one is something that's important, which is to have consideration on performance. Because as we've spoken so far, it is a very difficult period for the person, right? So to be able to consider that and to be able to hold that, and companies, can look at saying, for this period, we'll rate you in a certain way, we'll look at it, we'll protect your career. But that becomes like very, very important to do. At that time, if you're also adding on to the stress, right, then that is, that's just adding to the system, that's problematic. So that is something that you could choose to do. The last bit of it which I want to say is to decide that, for example, if there is some employee, there is a prospective hire who you found out through records, etc., background verification, is somebody who is a perpetrator of domestic violence, and that's something that is proven, because that legal proceeding is on, then are you going to hire such a person? What's your take on that? Because it's not just on this side, right? It's also on the other side. So what are some of the steps you're taking there? What are you going to do about that? That's also something that organizations can look at. So there's a whole lot of things that companies and organizations and workplaces, no matter what their sizes, can do.
We have a question from a viewer, and also something that I wanted to ask both of you. It's about, this being a topic that can possibly bring up quite a bit of shame, trauma, and a lot of vulnerability. How does one, if you think that someone around you may be experiencing domestic abuse, how do you actually bring this conversation up with respect and sensitivity? How do you begin to intuit when to back off and to say, hey, maybe this person's not ready to talk about it yet? Anika?
Yeah, and this is something which is actually a barrier when it comes to bystander intervention. And sadly, it's something which is very, very commonplace. Going back to the idea of who has the agency in that situation. The person who's actually going through the harassment abuse, are we going to take decision on their behalf, firstly? No matter whatever situation it may be, in the end, who is it that we are thinking about? Are we thinking about ourselves? Are we thinking about the family or the space that they're in? Or are we putting the person who needs all the support in center? So that prioritization is important. So we need to understand, hear them out, and also let them figure out how do they want to take the process forward. What you can be a facilitator, you can be a support, in terms of, if there's financial support needed, if there is emotional support needed, you could do all of that. But in the end, who decides what is best for them is the person who's actually in the whole space. the other thing is, we also think, Arey, but they are so hassled, they're not thinking right, they're not making the right decision. Again, let's stop infantilizing people, especially with women, because they're already being dehumanized at home. So let's not add more to it, right? So rather than that, you approach it from a very support sort of space where you say that, let's do what you want to do. If you need me to find out some information, I would get that information for you. If you need me to find out some accommodation, I would do that. Or if you need a job, maybe I can, talk to my circles and, then get you out. Because there is shame and honor and all of that linked to, and actually that cuts across all forms of violence against women. Um, the challenge becomes that who do we then pander to, or who then do we try to save in that case? Is something as simple as hurting community sentiments, are they more important, or family sentiments, or is the individual more important in that case? So we, from a very rights-based approach, we need to go and see what the person, what they want. So this is at least like what I feel Madhumitha feels.
Yeah. Yeah, recognizing somewhere what the indicators are. I think in addition to, so for example, if you see somebody with regular bruises or scars, right? Somebody who is co- there's fear, there's anxiety written on the face, there's a certain sense of loss and feeling that I'm lost, I don't know, there is confusion. Also the person's trying to withdraw, is trying to be isolated, is not being open, is not being transparent about their life or any of these things. And in a workplace, sudden dip in performance, absenteeism, presentism playing up, these are additional factors only for the workplace. If any of that is happening, I think irrespective of whether it is domestic violence or not, right, as somebody who's a well-wisher, who's observing it and who's a bystander, which means I'm witnessing this happening in front of me, my thing would be to reach out and say, and the rest of it is pretty much what Anika said, which is to say, I'm here to help, I'm concerned about you, what's happening with you, how can I help? And then leave the person to tell you, and believe the person when they tell you in which way they like you to help, instead of deciding what you need to do. So that's pretty much some of the signs that one can look at, and then yeah.
And of course, there's a lot more information on both the signs and what you as a bystander can do in Diversity Dialogue's book, Domestic Violence in the Indian Workplace. It's on our portal, and the link will be shared in the comments as well if you'd like to explore this topic deeper. I'd like to just close this panel with one last question to Anika. Anika, you work in the space of communications and digital campaigns. Do you think that we need to, relook the narrative we've built around domestic violence all of these years?
Always. Communication, while it's taken for granted, the challenge is that it's the most important thing or the most important thing that needs very solid strategies also. Because while the challenge, I can give an example of language. What kind of language are we using when we're talking about domestic violence? In English, we still have all of these big terms that we now have normalized using it, like even the word normalized. But in different languages that people speak, at least in our country or in our region, there are lots of languages firstly, and how do people communicate in that language also? So because I understand Hindi, I would give an example of wo bahut pareshan hai. Now that pareshani can also mean that I'm just generally very sad, or I am being abused. So the word pareshan is being used to express all of that. Or otherwise there is a word in Hindi which is shoshan. So now she's being harassed and violated. Now that's a very heavy word, right? So now what I'm actually trying to get at is understanding the language, and not just in terms of like literal language, but the message itself, is something that we really need to work on. The other bit is that when it comes to communication, we also need to understand that we live in a, I am, because I work in digital, so I keep on pushing for the whole understanding the innovation in digital spaces as well. I'll give you an example how NCW recently got all of these reports of cases of domestic violence were through text messages and WhatsApp. Um, let's not forget how technology can, while it has its cons and it can create a problem for the person who's going through it, it also provides a way out. So let's also think about those strategies which kind of work. Like I said, those young girls who were a part of that school ka WhatsApp group were able to intervene in an abusive situation when there was no police in the village. Like there was nobody that could have gone to help out. But then looking at these smaller technological innovations and communication is something which is important. And the last thing is the narratives built around women. That is something which we've seen. It's not new. We live in a patriarchal society. All of this is something that at least people here in this group are already aware of. But how do we create those alternative narratives? We love to counter stuff like, and a small example, don't rape. Yes, that is a counter. Or stop war. These are counters. But what is the alternative is something which has not been imagined. But that doesn't mean that those alternatives do not exist. But they have become the exception and not the norm. So we need to create norms out of exceptions where we are not normalizing violence. We're not normalizing the language of violence also. And then we have to have all of these strategies, which are, while they look at an individual, they also need to look at the broader culture and norms. So this is where we sort of work. And I think pop culture, there have been some really good examples of how people are challenging it. Something as simple as a film like Thappad, like a Hindi film like Thappad, which created a certain kind of conversation dialogue around domestic violence and how we're all complicit in the silence around it. But like I said, this is something we have to constantly push, even as individuals and organizations both. So that's where I would want to leave.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can just add, Ranjitha, and I'm going to say this because it just comes to me. We use this term, spare the rod, spoil the child, like it's an everyday term, right? We think that's absolutely okay. So in our everyday language, I mean, to sort of look at it and say that, I mean, that in its own way is talking about violence being okay. So that just comes to me and I wanted to put that out there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting, and I wish we could continue this conversation. We are running out of time, and for our viewers, if you'd like to know more about the work Madhumitha and Anika are doing, you can look up both Diversity Dialogues and Breakthrough on Facebook and Twitter and other social media. So do look up their work. There's a lot of wonderful work they're doing in this space. So before we, thank you so much, Anika and Madhumitha, for giving us your time and helping us really look at what is the role of a bystander. I think one thing that that clearly stood out for me in this conversation is the idea of no action being too small or too insignificant. And it's better to take a tiny step than not to take any at all. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.